Welcome to part 2 of the TOLA videos. In part 1, I explain the policy context of TOLA. This video is a deep dive into TOLA. It is very dense. Grab a drink, sit comfortably, and let's go. Now, under the Telecommunications Act of 1997, carriers and carriage service providers already had obligations to assist ASIO and law enforcement agencies. The main provision was under this section 313 of the Act. Now, although this requirement existed, TOLA was about expanding its scope to designated communications providers, a category that included carriers and carriage service providers that were already covered by section 313, but also included a range of other people and entities involved with communications, including even manufacturers of communications equipment. Okay, here we go. Let's try to explain TOLA without this becoming a strange alphabet soup of acronyms. There are 4 parts to TOLA. Schedule 1 is the beefy bit. It amends a handful of different acts in order to create a new industry assistance framework. Under this framework, the Directors General of ASIO, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, the Australian Signals Directorate, or the Chief Officer of an interception agency, which we mean COPS, may ask for help from a communications provider. Now, the request is entirely voluntary, and it's called a technical assistance request. Prior to TOLA, there was nothing stopping collaborative team-ups, but there was a gap in the law. If a communications provider voluntarily helped out, this might expose them to civil liability from some other third party who might suffer some loss as a result of helping out. Easy example. This is the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess. Actually, I know that I'm running low on time, but Mike Burgess is very unusual for a head of ASIO in that he was for a time the Chief Information Security Officer for Telstra. So it's unusual for industry experience to come with the head of ASIO, and it's particularly relevant to TOLA that he actually does have the industry experience that you'd expect. So anyway, Mike Burgess, that's him. And Burgess says to a communications provider, hey, can you help out on a completely voluntary basis and patch this exploit that we suspect is being used by people to evade detection on your network? And the communications provider is like, oh yeah, absolutely no worries. We didn't even realize there was this exploit. But what nobody realizes, and perhaps they should have realized, is that Iron Man here has this really lucrative next generation technology company that absolutely depended upon that exploit for completely legitimate reasons. The patch that ASIO requested has a serious financial impact upon the Iron Man. Now, under the pre-TOLA days, he might have been able to sue to recover damages if it wasn't already covered by section 313. Now, he definitely does not. The communications company gets an immunity from civil liability. So, this was the technical assistance request. There was some media commentary that besides Operation Ironside, TOLA had not yet been used. This is wrong. We know that the technical assistance requests have been used, and that makes absolute sense because it was regularizing an activity that was already taking place. Voluntary collaborations with industry partners were already going on. Now, what was different is that it now had a statutory footing and it now extended the civil liability for people who were helping. But what if the communications provider doesn't want to do what's being requested? And what if the communications doesn't want help? And what if ASIO, the AFP, the Australian Crime Commission, or a state or territory police force really need them to do what's requested in order to enforce serious Australian criminal law, assist overseas partners to enforce serious foreign offences, or safeguard national security? Well, under the Industry Assistance Framework of Schedule 1, TOLA creates technical assistance notices. In a nutshell, this isn't just an invitation to collaborate, this is an instruction that the communications provider must follow. They are coercive, but they are rare. We know that up until the middle of last year, no technical assistance notices had been issued. But remember, their scope is narrower. You can only force the hand of the communications provider if we're dealing with serious issues. Now, in the example with Iron Man before, there was an exploit that allowed, potentially, people to evade detection. This probably would not meet the high threshold needed to issue a technical assistance notice. Instead, ASIO would need to show that the assistance was required to safeguard national security, or the interception agency, by which we mean cops, would need to show how it was related to a serious crime. And a serious crime here is one that is punishable by a maximum term of imprisonment for 3 years or more, or for life. There's still more. We've seen technical assistance requests, the voluntary request for help. We've seen technical assistance notices, a direction for non-voluntary help. But both of these depended upon the communications provider being able to provide the assistance. Now, what if I'm setting up a communications network and I am deliberately doing it in a way that reduces my ability to provide assistance to authorities if needed? What if I'm doing something deliberately to avoid the effectiveness of technical assistance requests and notices? Welcome to the most controversial part of Schedule 1, the technical capability notices. The Attorney General can issue a notice to a communications provider requiring them to ensure that they are able to be subject to a technical assistance notice. It basically ensures that technical assistance notices can be as effective as possible when they are needed. Why was this controversial? Well, because lots of people read this as saying that if you were a company that facilitated encrypted communication, you would have to ensure that there was a backdoor for ASIO and the cops to snoop on encrypted messages. Those people are wrong, and I gave them a lot of shit for being wrong. But the ordinary reader of this legislation is probably not being unreasonable despite being wrong. Why? Because TOLA is blisteringly complex. Now, one thing that I haven't revealed in this video so far is section 317E, the list of acts and things. If you are getting voluntary cooperation from a communications provider, so a technical assistance request from before, of course, the things that you can ask for voluntarily are necessarily quite broad, and you don't tend to care about what they can voluntarily request. But if you are making a demand, a technical assistance notice or a technical capability notice, then the list of things that you are able to demand should be restricted. Coercive powers need limits. You read the Act and you see that technical assistance notice can only request acts or things listed in section 317E. And you see that the same is true for technical capability notices, except there's also a provision for other acts or things to be listed through delegated legislation. Don't worry about that bit. So you're like, I wonder what's in section 317E. And your eyes basically pop out of your head when the first thing you see listed is removing one or more forms of electronic protection that are or were applied by or on behalf of the provider. Holy crap! Wait until everybody's blog hears about this. ASIO, cops, the Attorney General, they now have the power to demand a communications provider to make their product left safe? Like, how is this possibly appropriate? How is this not authorizing backdoors into encrypted systems? Now, if you got this far with the Act, okay, fair play. It was reasonable to think that all the experts were wrong and the Act really did allow for backdoors. There was no reason to think that in the 200 pages of the Act there was a trick to this. Buried, and I mean buried, deep in the guts of the Act and not referenced in any of the sections that we've just been talking about, there is an entire new division of limitations that included section 317ZG. So that means we go through the alphabet and then we punch through the other side and we get to G after going through Z and a bunch of Ys, and it's all a mess, right? So long way in the Act. 317ZG. The notices and requests must not have the effect of requesting or requiring a systemic weakness or a systemic vulnerability in electronic protection, or the effect of preventing a communications provider from fixing a systemic weakness or vulnerability. What are systemic weaknesses and vulnerabilities? Well, the Act defines them. A systemic vulnerability means a vulnerability that affects a whole class of technology, but does not include a vulnerability that is selectively introduced to one or more target technologies that are connected with a particular person. And a systemic weakness means a weakness that affects a whole class of technology, but does not include a weakness that is selectively introduced to one or more target technologies that are connected with a particular person. Now, if that looks like a jumble of legalese, the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor agrees with you and thinks that that should be redrafted so that it's simpler and clearer to the ordinary reader. It looks really tricky, but it's actually benign. For the humans in the audience, this means that you cannot put a backdoor in the encrypted messaging software, as this would affect a whole class of technology and make it weaker and more vulnerable. Section 317ZG prevents it. Now, even if you're like, Mark, I do not believe you. I have eyes and a brain full of conspiracies, and I know what words mean, and I do not believe that TOLA prohibits backdoors unless it expressly says that. Well, you are in luck, because subsection 317ZG2 expressly prohibits systemically undermining encryption. And this was placed in the legislation for the avoidance of doubt. No backdoors. And I know that it was inserted for the avoidance of doubt because subsection 4 says that this subsection was enacted for the avoidance of doubt. More. The division of limitations also ensures there's nothing in this new framework that undermines the existing need to get warrants or authorizations for accessing an individual's communication or data. This section of TOLA was entirely about ensuring that the existing powers remained effective, and therefore these new sections do not encroach upon the privacy of individuals. Framed differently. Schedule 1 is all about ensuring that current powers to access communications remained effective. Now we get to see Milan. How are we going? That was heavy lifting. It's dense, it's complex, it's made worse by needing to have one eye on the existing framework, which has been described as gothic due to how elaborate it is, while also seeing how the new legislation interacts with them. But now you get the major part of TOLA in broad strokes. The industry assistance framework regularized how authorities can work, either voluntarily or not, with communications providers. Okay, I'm nearly 15 minutes in. Let's see if we can get the others done. Schedule 2 of TOLA is pretty easy. Prior to TOLA, ASIO already had the power to access information on computers covertly. They'd had this power since 1999, and the power needed a little bit of a tidy up because it had become clunky. Now, although this is covered by Section 2 of TOLA, that is the cleanup that was needed, it's not the big biscuit, and none of the cleanup should really worry you. What should draw your attention is that TOLA creates a new warrant for other agencies to obtain computer access warrants. These warrants are issued by a judge or a nominated member of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal so that law enforcement agencies can access data on a target computer. One of the important aspects of this warrant is that it can also authorize the concealment of the access. Police already had the ability to go in and seize a computer and take it into evidence. What it lacked was the ability to access a computer so that authorities could see the commissioning of an offence, the identity of the offenders, or the location of the offenders. The computer access warrant is available for law enforcement officials where they suspect a person of a crime, where the penalty for the crime is 3 years imprisonment or more, or for life, plus a few specific crimes. Now, this is an example where authorities can now do something that they couldn't do before, and so, in this sense, erodes privacy. But the only people whose privacy is invaded are those who are reasonably suspected of being involved in a serious crime, and the warrant is issued by a judge or a member of the AAT. So, on balance, this is pretty small potatoes. Schedules 3 and 4 are also pretty small potatoes. These two schedules amend the existing legal frameworks for criminal law enforcement agencies and Australian Border Force, who was previously Customs, to collect evidence from electronic devices. Importantly, the warrants now authorised law enforcement agencies and Border Force to use a computer or device in order to access account-based data that was accessible from the device. I love this. This is so cool, right? Account-based data is where instead of the data being stored on the device, which authorities could access, the data is stored somewhere else and the device accesses that data wherever it's stored. So there was some doubt that authorities could access it. Now, some settings of Dropbox, for example, if you're trying to get your head around this, if you don't download all the files onto your local device but keep them all, in the cloud, this is an example of account-based data. Small potatoes, but my reading of the situation is that it was these warrants that facilitated Operation Ironside. I could be wrong, but it really looks like it. Finally, Schedule 5 includes some new powers for ASIO. The voluntary assistance request that we looked at earlier is replicated, but outside the scope of the communications providers. So, if you're not a communications provider and you help ASIO voluntarily, you can't be sued by some third party for damage or loss. We've already covered this when we discussed it earlier. It's pretty tame. The other power is more coercive. If ASIO thinks that you can help it to access data held in or accessible from a computer or data storage device that's already the subject of a warrant or otherwise lawfully able to be searched by ASIO, then ASIO can order you to provide assistance. Again, nobody's privacy is invaded because this is information that is already lawfully able to be obtained. The real kicker is that ASIO can force a third party to provide it with assistance to access the data. Congrats! That was very loud. I don't know if I just blew the speakers, but you now know TOLA in broad strokes. Here is how the Independent National Legislation Security Monitor gives an overview of the TOLA. Schedule 1 gives police and intelligence agencies new powers to agree or require significant industry assistance from communications providers. Schedules 2, 3, and 4 update existing powers and, in some cases, extend them to new agencies. Schedule 5 gives the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, significant new powers to seek and receive both voluntary and compulsory assistance. As we have seen, Schedules 1 and 5 do not involve giving powers to the state to access new kinds of information about citizens, and yet these were much more controversial than Schedules 2, 3, and 4, which extended powers to new agencies. I find that interesting. Do you want to hear my criticism of TOLA? Yeah, we're at 20 minutes, but we'll do it. We can do this quickly. Here are my criticisms of TOLA. Clearly, not all of TOLA was as urgent as the other parts. We know that technical assistance notices and technical capability notices were not used within the first year and a half of the Act coming into force. There was, therefore, no urgency to push these through. We know that the technical assistance requests were used, but these were just a formalization of what was already taking place. It is difficult to see the urgency. Only the urgent parts should have been pushed through. 2. Because the public was so poorly informed about TOLA, a lot of mythology was allowed to flourish. This does not only hurt you for this time, it hurts you for the next time when you want to push new powers urgently to deal with a live issue. And finally, a media event where you say, hi, we arrested several hundred people and prevented a bunch of murders thanks to TOLA, and yet you can't point to specifically which powers you used, this generates a lot of suspicion and doubt. I think journalists were right to call into question some of the claims about the use of TOLA, but I don't think they were sufficiently well informed to understand how to question the claims. For example, The Guardian discovered, pretty easily, that Operation Trojan Shield began life a few months prior to TOLA. This should not shock us. It showed that the AFP wasn't lying when it said that it needed the powers urgently. But it does look dishonest to the ordinary observer. And it's not enough for the government to be honest, they also have to look honest. There are also other reasonable criticisms of TOLA. For example, remember Iron Man from before? There is an argument that is reasonably expressed that Iron Man might be unreasonably hard done by and deserves greater protections than TOLA affords him. Indeed, the equivalent power in Schedule 5, where ASIO is able to make voluntary requests and give immunity from civil liability as the result of the assistance, was criticised by the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor as being manifestly unfair to Iron Man if he suffers significant loss. Not only is Iron Man barred from suing, he also would struggle to challenge the bar that's been placed on him. But what I hope I've been able to show in this video is enough information about TOLA so that the ordinary person can understand what it was attempting to achieve in broad strokes. It wasn't an unreasonable power grab. It wasn't a fresh assault on your civil liberties. It was a response to a real problem that was threatening the effectiveness of existing powers. That is it for this video. In the next video, if I'm not distracted by breaking defamation law news, I'll link up the bigger picture of TOLA so that you don't need to trust that everything is above board, but have some reassurance that we can verify that everything is above board. Until next time, feel welcome to leave me comments on Twitter @LegalReckoning, and I'm reminded that I need to tell everybody to like and subscribe. Bye-bye.